right. Look at that. We are YouTube Live also.
Ooh, ah, fancy.
I've never used that feature before. I hope it works. All right, it's time.
If it works.
Just for the family?
No, there's a bunch of other people here.
Oh.
And all of them need to know that it's Moshe's birthday.
That's true. Happy birthday, Yehuda and Moshe. Yom Huledet Sameach, rather.
All right. It's time. We'll start. Okay. Hello, everyone. I gave this class 2 years ago at OSTT around the same time of year. There are actually a few things that have changed a bit, some more information. I also don't think that anyone who was there at the time that I gave it then is actually in the community anymore. So we'll do it again and have a little fun with it this time, because if I'm not doing it on Shabbos, I can use PowerPoint. I actually first started giving this 12 years ago, and I've given it a few times. So let's get started, I guess. If you couldn't tell from the title, we're going to be talking about hand matzah versus machine matzah, the history and the halacha involved in that discussion. So I guess we'll start a little bit with the history. Pre-industrial revolution, no one had ever done anything much with a machine. In the Industrial Revolution, the mid-1800s, so there were water-powered and air-powered machines for everything, and people were just looking for all kinds of ways just to make it easier to make stuff. The picture in the top right is a matzah machine, an early matzah machine that only rolled the dough. The dough would be mixed first by hand. It would then be rolled on this machine, and it would then be removed from this machine and baked by hand in a traditional oven. If you were ever at the old Sienna's Pizza location, their first location where you could see into the kitchen, this machine is pretty much the same as the machine that they use to roll their pizza dough. Even though most of this discussion will follow the rabbis in Europe, in America, the explosive growth of the Jewish population in that time meant that a machine was the only possible way to make enough matzah for everybody. The famous Dovber Manischewitz, founder of Manischewitz, did not start baking matzah until 1888. And most of this discussion precedes that, but there was a lot of discussion about it in America at the time. We just don't have very much written record of it that I could find in my research, just records that there was such a discussion. In any case, so I have a little timeline here. In 1838, the first machine was introduced in France, and the major French and Bavarian, German rabbis all approved of it, and it was similar to this picture. The machine made it to the major cities in Frankfurt, 1845. It made it to the US. The Jewish newspapers in the US were talking about it around 1850, 1852 in Poland, 1858 Pressburg, that was Hungary, now Slovakia, and the Ktav Sofer was originally very wary of the early machines. After in-depth research and demonstrations of how it worked, he eventually gave his enthusiastic approval. That note is going to come back a few times about research and demonstration. So those are the early machines. By 1857, most of Europe was using machines for rolling out their matzah. London, Paris, Breslov, all over Germany, all over pretty much everywhere. And there were enthusiastic endorsements by lots of Rabbanim, specifically lots in France, Germany, Austria, Hungary. Rav Yaakov Ettlinger, the Aruch L'Ner, is one of the very well-known names. He wrote, every God-fearing Jew who is familiar with the machine, is pleased with the way it operates, with the quality of the kashrut and the speed with which the matzah is made. And there are notes from that time that by the late 1850s, the Jews of France and Germany pretty much were not making any matzah by hand at all. They were almost entirely using the machine. And why that is pretty clear. There were major problems with making matzah. There weren't enough Jews to bake the matzah. The workers who were doing it were so tired that they couldn't properly knead the dough. They were collapsing over it. And the non-Jewish workers who they had to hire to make up the slack just weren't careful about chametz. Some were caught eating bread over the dough while they worked. Needless to say, that's a problem. Cleanliness of the dough, if it's touched by fewer hands, it's just going to be cleaner. Consistency, every matzah comes out exactly the same. Even today, that's one of the big selling points of machine matzah. And also the big one, price. You cut labor costs in half, you drive matzah prices down. That further increases demand because people can now afford to buy more matzah than they could have before. And then you come up with further streamlining, further improvements in the machines. This also had the side effect of reducing the reliance on ma'ot chitiim to fund just basic purchases of matzah for the Seder, and allowed that money to be used for other needs. And for all of these reasons, many Rabbanim in Europe and in the United States really preferred machine matzah at the time.
Okay.
Now we get to the fun part. So in 1858, the machine, it's referred to as the machine all over the literature, comes to Galicia. Now it's Ukraine and southern Poland. And the rabbis of Krakow, Brody, and Lvov were very wary of it. And they all went to Rav Shlomo Kluger, who was one of the greatest rabbinic minds of the region at the time, possibly more than just of the region, but is very, very well known in that place in that time. And he said, after some inspection and some discussion, he said, matzah is to be baked only by hand, and no machines are allowed to be used at all for any reason. And he had many reasons. Now, before we talk about his reasons, we will digress a little bit because we need to talk about what the requirements are. Where'd my pointer go? We need to talk about what the requirements are for matzah and what his issues with it would have been. So what are the requirements for matzah? The obvious first requirement, matzah may not be chametz, because then it's not matzah. Everybody knows the famous 18 minutes, and if it's not more than 18 minutes, then it's chametz. We'll get to in a second where that comes from. But first, a little bit of the sources of where that is. The pasuk says in Shemot, Parshat Bo, it says, it's here, Shivat yamim matzot tochelu, you should eat matzah for 7 days. Ach bayom harishon tashbitu se'or mibateichem, you need to remove all leaven from your house before the first day. Ki kol ochel chametz v'nichurta hanefesh hahi miyisrael miyom harishon ad yom hashvi'i, because anyone who eats chametz will be cut off from Bnei Israel between those first and seventh days eating chametz. So from that pasuk, we learn you're not allowed to have chametz, you need to eat matzah. There's various other pasukim also, but the basic idea, no chametz. So then we need to talk about the time. So the Gemara says, I'll start with the Mishnah says here, that if you have batzek hacheresh, which literally means a deaf dough, but it's explained to mean dough that you're not sure whether it has become chametz or not. Im yesh kayotze bo shehichmitz harei ze asur. If you have a similar dough that's been similar amount of time, a similar size, a similar amount of flour, water, whatever it is, and you know that the other one has become chametz, then you will say this one has also become chametz as well, even though you weren't totally sure. So then the Gemara, of course, has to ask, im ein sham kayotze bo mahu, what's going to be the halacha? If you don't have another piece of dough, how do you know whether this piece has become chametz or not? It doesn't seem like it's going to be so easy to determine. So the Gemara answers, how the time period it's going to be is Kedei she'elech adam mi migdal nunya l'Tveria, and that is a meal, which many of the English language later commentaries explain is what the Romans would have called a mile, and we hold that it's approximately a kilometer, approximately. It's about 2,000 amot, exactly how you measure. We're not going to get into that. That's not so relevant to us because meal here is not for the distance. Meal here is for the amount of time that it takes to walk that distance. And the commentaries all describe that time, and we'll get to that. Did I not print? Oh, yep, that's the next source here, the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch says, at the bottom, just the underlined part, v'shiur meal, the amount of time for a meal, have a revi'it sha'ah, a quarter of an hour, v'chelek me'esrim mina sha'ah, plus 1/20th of an hour, 3 minutes, gets you 18 minutes. One additional source on this, the Gemara talks about if you know because you have a similar piece of dough versus if you don't know. So the Rambam, which I deliberately did not include in these sources, gives instructions, fairly specific instructions for testing whether dough is chametz. And since I don't want you to try it on my account, I'm not sharing what they are. Other chametz factors here, the continual handling of the dough from the Gemara, but we're just quote the Shulchan Aruch again. Shulchan Aruch says, "Lo yanichu ha'isa below esek ve'afilu rega echad." You are not allowed to leave the dough unworked even for a moment. V'chol zman shemit askim bo afilu kol hayom eno machmitz. If you are working on the dough, you're kneading the dough, as long as you keep continuously working it, even without stopping at all, even if it would be for the entire day, it still would not become chametz. Ve'im hanichu below esek shir mil have chametz. Once you stop working it, once you stop kneading it, that's when the 18 minutes starts. So that's one of the additional requirements. Other requirements we've talked about. The Gemara talks about that the dough cannot be too warm. If it's warm, that will cause the rising process to happen faster. And part of that is what's called mayim shelanu, that the water that was used to make the matzah dough is supposed to be drawn the night before you're going to bake the matzah and left overnight to sit, because that way you'll be sure that it will be cool and it won't cause the chametz process to start too quickly. A final requirement that's commonly discussed, but that does not appear anywhere in the Gemara, is the requirement that the matzah be completely, perfectly baked and be flat. Flat here means two things. One is that it is not allowed to swell up, and it is like a pita is the example with a pocket, big air pocket, and it's not allowed to be folded over itself. And both of those things are because in order to bake quickly enough and fully enough, bake straight through, you need it to be flat and consistently the same thickness all the way. Otherwise, you have concern that it might not be fully baked. A side point, on the 18 minutes, if you look at the packaging of matzah, you'll see that some matzah just says matzah, It might say kosher Pesach, and some matzah will say 18-minute matzah. Now, if we just said that 18 minutes is generally considered the rule, why is some matzah specifically called 18-minute matzah? And the reason is because machine matzah that is not labeled 18 minutes is made in a continuous production, never stopping, such that any tiny crumbs of dough that separate from an earlier batch will get mixed into a subsequent batch. And because it takes 18 minutes for dough to become chametz, but less than 5 minutes for dough to run through the entire production line, even if those crumbs are in the next batch a few feet further back on the line, they will still definitely be baked within the 18 minutes. 18-minute matzah, specifically labeled so, is that after every 18 minutes, they stop the machinery completely, they clean the machinery completely, and that way you are 100% guaranteed that there are no crumbs that might possibly be older than 18 minutes. So that was our first requirement, not chametz. Our second requirement for matzah is that it's made from one of the 5 grains: wheat, barley, rye, oats, or spelt. In practice today, we use almost exclusively wheat, except people who use oat matzah or spelt matzah for medical reasons. But briefly, we'll see the Gemara and the Mishnah and the Gemara that talk about this. The Mishnah says, "Elu dvarim she'adam yotzei behem yidei chovato b'Pesach." These things can be used for the matzah that a person uses to fulfill his obligation, that meaning the obligation to eat matzah on the Seder night. B'chitim, b'sarim, b'kusmin, b'shifon, u'v'shibolet shibal. And instead of translating those right now and going through what each one is and how the Gemara determines what they are, what they mean, we'll just say we know wheat, barley, rye, oats, and spelt. So the Gemara talks a little more. I'll skip down to the second highlighted portion. Amar Kra, the pasuk says, "Lo tochal alav chametz, shivat yamim tochal alav matzot." You're not allowed to eat chametz with the Karban Pesach. You have to eat matzah for 7 days. So how do we know that those 5 grains are the matzah you are supposed to be eating for 7 days? Because dvarim habaim lidei chimutz adam yotzei behem yidei chovato b'matzah. Anything that can become chametz can be used for matzah to fulfill the mitzvah. Yatzu elu she'ein ba'in lidei chimutz el lidei sirchon. That excludes things like rice or quinoa or pick your whatever other pseudo grain you'd like, because those things don't become chametz. They don't have a dough that rises. Those things become fermented. They become vinegar or alcohol, something like that, and that is they don't become a dough that rises like the 5 grains do. And Rashi notes here, what are we talking about? He says, a little closer to read it. Dvarim habaim lidei chimutz adam yotzei behem mishum matzah imasan matzah. If you made matzah out of these 5 grains, you can be yotzei the mitzvah of matzah with them. And he notes orez udochan, or rice, and I think we translate dochan as millet. Ein osin chametz, they don't become chametz. And if you tried to make them chametz, you would just leave them out for some time. They would still not become chametz. They would just become fermented. And so that's our second requirement for matzah. Our third requirement, and here's where we get into the major discussion, and we'll turn back to the next back to the issue of hand matzah versus machine matzah, is lishma, the intent that you have in making the matzah, and we'll actually go into what that means in preparing it. So the Mishnah had said, and the Mishnah gives a whole list of things that you can use for matzah and also of things you can't use for matzah. And the Mishnah says, Chalat Toda Rukike Nazir. These are similar, they are unleavened bread. So you could call them matzah in theory, but they were made, instead of being made to use for Pesach, for the Seder, they were made to bring with a karban toda or a karban of a nazir in the Beit HaMikdash. And the Mishnah says you're not allowed to use those for being yotzei, the mitzvah of matzah at the Seder. So, minahani mili, how do we know that? The Gemara asks, Amar Rabba de Amar Kra. The pasuk says, Yishmartem et hamatzot. You have to guard the matzot. Matzah hamishtameret l'shem matzah. That means you need to eat matzah at the Seder that was guarded for the name, literally, for the purpose of being matzah. Yatztazu she'ein mishameret l'shem matzah. That excludes these things which were not guarded for the sake of being matzah to use at the Seder. Ela l'shum zevach, they were made to be used for a karban, either a karban toda or a karban nazir in the Beit HaMikdash. And Rav Yosef Amar Kra, different pasuk, Shivat Yamim Matzah Tochelu, Matzah Hane'achelet l'Shivat Yamim, matzah needs to be eaten for all 7 days of Pesach. Yatztazu she'ena ne'achelet l'Shivat Yamim el yom v'layla, but the karbanot of Toda and Nazir can only be eaten for 1 day, so they can't be eaten for 7 days, and therefore that's the hint to you that they cannot be used for matzah. But the primary focus, our first focus, matzah needs to be hamishtameret l'shem matzah, guarded to be used for matzah. And what does that mean, guarded? Does it mean an armored truck and guards with machine guns? Rashi says, it tells us, kol shimur she'ata mishamra shelo tachmitz hitkaven l'shem matzah shel mitzvah. Any guarding you do to ensure that it does not become chametz, you need to have in mind that it is for the purpose of being matzah to use at the Seder, to be yotzei, the mitzvah of matzah. And that would mean when you're making sure that the grain is stored properly, you're storing the grain l'shem matzah mitzvah. When you're making sure that it's being ground properly, you're doing it l'shem matzah mitzvah. When you're baking it to do it properly, it's l'shem matzah mitzvah. And over, in every step of the process, you are saying, I am doing this l'shem matzah mitzvah. If you look in any matzah bakery, you will see signs all over the bakery. Remember to say l'shem matzah mitzvah, because it matters. And if you wouldn't do that, then it would still be kosher matzah to use, say, Pesach morning, to use on the 3rd day, the 6th day, the 7th day, the 8th day, but it would not be good matzah to use at the Seder itself, because the matzah at the Seder itself has this special requirement. So a little more on that. We see it in halacha also. What does it mean to guard it? So the Shulchan Aruch says, Hachitim shosa behem matzah mitzvah, tov l'shamran shelo yiplu aleihem mayim mishat ktsira, ulefachot mishat tchina. You need to, the wheat that you're using to make the matzah that you're going to use for the mitzvah of the Seder, it should be guarded so that no water comes in contact with it from the time it's harvested, or if you can't do that, at a minimum from the time that it's ground up. The crossed out line, the Shulchan Aruch says, if you don't have any of that, you can still use regular flour. In our modern times, that is not true. You cannot use regular flour from the supermarket to make matzah today, because our modern flour processing is chametz. It is guaranteed 100% to be chametz. So we don't do that. The Mishnah Berurah notes on that, that specifically we're talking about the matzah eaten on the first 2 nights at the Seder to be mekayim the mitzvah. And that's what needs this extra watching the wheat, watching the flour. And it's not enough to just say, we have a proof that there's no chametz here because we stored this wheat and we stored this flour in a perfectly sealed metal box that had no water in it. you actually need somebody to be watching, somebody to be guarding, someone to be careful, and to make sure that it's good. Because it says in the pasuk, "Ushmartem et hamatzot," so that's an extra effort that we make to watch it. And the Mishnah Berurah also notes that even though this is only a requirement for the Seder itself, there are those who have the custom of only using shmura matzah all of Pesach and not using any other kind, even though you're allowed to. But it's a practice that people have to be strict. The Shulchan Aruch also notes in the process of making matzah, he says, "Ein lashin matzat mitzvah v'lo ofinota al yidei eno Yehudi v'lo al yidei cheresh shotev v'katan." The matzah dough may not be kneaded or baked by a non-Jew or by a deaf mute, a person without full mental capacity, or a minor. And the reason for that is going to be because those people, someone is echoing here, so I'm going to mute this. If anyone has any questions, you're welcome to unmute and to ask them. But for now, or to ask them in the chat. But for now, I'm muting everyone just because someone was just doing feedback a second ago. So the Shulchan Aruch says that a non-Jew or someone without full mental capacity are not allowed to be involved in mixing the matzah dough or baking the matzah. And the implication there is because they cannot have that intent of making matzah to fulfill the mitzvah. A non-Jew, because he doesn't have the mitzvah, and a cheresh shotev v'katan, these other groups, a minor or someone with otherwise without full mental capacity, because they don't have the mental capacity to do it. So, there's my pointer. So now we'll get back to the discussion about what the reasons of Rav Shlomo Kluger were to disallow using a machine for matzah. Rav Shlomo Kluger, in his discussion, breaks it up into three reasons. His reasons are so complex that I have rebroken them up into 7 reasons. He has numbers 1 and 2 together, 3 through 5 together, and 6 and 7 together. But in any case, we'll go through them. So his first reason is, he says, we just talked about disallowing a deaf mute, a mentally incompetent person, or a minor, because they all have minimal mental capacity. And that is true even with Jewish adult supervision. So certainly we should disallow a machine because it has no mental capacity of any kind. So now you'll say, okay, that's only for the mitzvah of matzah, but what about matzah that is just regular old matzah for the rest of Pesach? So he says, because of lifnei iver, the prohibition against placing a stumbling block in front of someone who is blind, which actually means placing a stumbling block in front of anyone to cause them to harm themselves or to cause them to do an avera. So if this matzah that's made by a machine is prohibited for use at the Seder, we also need to prohibit it for the rest of Pesach in order to prevent confusion and mistakes of people using the wrong thing. His next reason is, he says, the warmth caused both by the movement of the mechanisms and of the dough being near the mouth of the oven as it enters the oven on a conveyor belt will cause the dough to rise in less than 18 minutes. Again, we talked about the requirement there of the dough not being too warm, and this is going to cause a problem that way. Reason number 4, he says, everybody wanted their round matzah because round is the traditional shape for matzah. Now, The problem is you can see in my little picture here, if you roll out a big sheet of dough and you cut out round matzahs from it, you're left with all this extra stuff between them, around them. And what are you going to do with all that? So typically they wouldn't want to waste it. They would run it through a second time and they would make new circles. The problem is that takes more time. And again, we'll go back to one of the requirements. We discussed that as long as you're working the dough, it won't become chametz. As soon as you stop working it, such as having it rolled out flat, just sitting here on the table, now it's going to become, the timer is going to start going, it's going to become chametz. And that causes, the effect of that is going to be that it is much more likely there will be chametz in the matzah baking factory because of all that waste. He notes some people have attempted to rectify this issue by making square matzah, but the minhag is to have round matzah, and you can't change the minhag. The practice is round. Who are you to make it square? His next issue, he says, is that unground and partially ground wheat kernels that are mixed into the dough will cause it to become chametz because of how the water doesn't get fully into them, they don't get fully baked, various other issues with them. And a machine can't find that. That will only be found as workers are kneading the dough with their hands, and with their hands they feel the little lumps and they take them out. He notes that in 50 years as the rabbi in Brody, this unground and partially ground wheat kernel issue was found every single year. So it's a major problem, and in the machine, you're not going to find that. So then he brings another reason. He says, the Gemara talks about a discussion about a certain kind of Syrian bread that's shaped in a particular way, and says that for the most part, they may not be made on Pesach because it takes a long time to shape them, and in that time they'll become chametz. The discussion there is that there actually are other types. There's another way. You could make it with a mold, or you could be a professional baker who makes it really quickly, and then it won't become chametz. And the Gemara says, we don't care. And based on that Gemara, the Tur says, all such bread, all such Syrian-shaped bread will be prohibited to make on Pesach because it's too hard to give the general public instructions about which type they're allowed to use and which type they're not allowed to use. So asking people to remember the rules about which matzah is allowed, which matzah isn't allowed, is too complicated, and it will cause people to make mistakes. You need to have only one kind of matzah that's kosher, the traditional handmade kind. Specifically what he's referring to here when he says it's too complicated is if you have hand matzah and you also have machine matzah, then you also need to have people say, well, there's matzah made by a non-Jew, there's matzah made by a child, there's matzah made by a machine, there's matzah made by this, there's matzah made by that. If you only have one kind of matzah, this one kind of hand matzah is allowed, everything else is not, and you don't have anything to worry about. And his final point is that he says baking matzah, the hand matzah bakeries where they had this big problem with labor shortages and all that, that drove up the price. That meant that baking matzah was a major source of income for the widows and orphans who worked in the bakeries, who would actually make enough money baking matzah for Pesach to live on for the whole year. He says, additionally, there's the mitzvah of ma'ut chitim, literally that's wheat money, which is of giving money to the poor before Pesach so they can buy the matzah, they can buy the wine, and they can buy other things they need for Pesach. Parenthetically, if you have not given, I assume the rabbi's discretionary fund is accepting ma'ut chitim as usual, donations by contacting the rabbi or through the shul's website. In any case, a lot of people in that time were not properly fulfilling the mitzvah of ma'ut chitim by giving money. And if they would instead be buying their matzah at these inflated prices because of the labor, and that money would be going to the widows and orphans and other poor people who worked in the bakeries, the people would be fulfilling the mitzvah of ma'ut chitim, even though they weren't intending to. So those are his reasons for prohibiting machine matzah. And those were the reasons that were originally published that year in 1858. In 1859, Rav Shlomo Kluger's student, Rav Chaim Dembitzer, gathered letters from Rav Shlomo Kluger and 9 other rabbis, and they published a book of all the reasons they could think of to prohibit machine matzah. Even though the book was published by Rav Chaim Dembitzer, the name, if you can make it out there, that appears on the front as the author is Shlomo Kluger. There were, and we'll discuss some possible reasons for that when we get to the next slide. But very briefly, there were some very, very famous names involved in this book. The book was called the Moda'ah Lebeit Yisrael. Moda'ah means an announcement to the house of Israel, an announcement to the Jews. And they wrote so strongly that 40 years after this book was published, the Avnei Nezer says that since the great ones who preceded us have prohibited it, and they were so forceful about that, they must have had correct reasons. And even if we think they were wrong, they were so forceful about it that it's not our place to change that ruling. Some of the names, Rav Mordechai Zev Ettinger, author of the Magen Giborim, which the Mishnah Berurah quotes hundreds of times, Rav Meir Auerbach, Rav Chaim Halberstam, the sons of Rav Divrei Chaim, Rav Yitzchak Meir of Gur, the Chidushei Harim. People may recognize these names, even if you don't, they're big names. In addition to Rav Shlomo Kluger's original 7 reasons that I quoted earlier, there are additional discussions they have. They mention the practice of matzah shapes. They mention all those other things. They also have some interesting discussion around claims that the introduction of the machine was a plot by the German Jewish reform movement to reduce the observance of the religious community. And they had very good reason to claim such things. They also claimed that the machinery has crevices that allow crumbs to fall in and get stuck where they can't be easily cleaned, which also was an issue with some of the earlier machines. It was a problem. But the most serious issue they discuss, the issue they come back to over and over in all 10 of them, is this issue of intent that we discussed. That if a person needs to have the proper intent when making the hand matzah, how can a machine which has no intent be able to make the matzah? At the same time, there were many other rabbanim. We already mentioned there were dozens, hundreds, thousands of rabbanim who allowed a machine matzah. So Rav Yosef Shaul Nathanson, immediately after the publication of the Moda'ah Lebeit Yisrael, published the Sefer Bitul Moda'ah, the annulment of the announcement, in which he gathered letters from 19 other prominent rabbis. So this book has double the rabbis of the previous one. And they published this book all about allowing machine matzah. Rav Nathanson, referred to as the Shoel Umeshiv, after the name of his big work, his Sefer, was also one of the greatest rabbanim of his time, of his location. He was actually a close friend and a study partner of Rav Mordechai Zev Ettinger, the Magen Giborim, who we just mentioned was one of the people in the other book. Until this controversy, they studied together. There is historical evidence that they were working on a sefer together, which would have been one of the greatest halachic works of that century, except that it became lost because of this controversy when they stopped working together. Other famous names who were involved in this one: Rav Yisrael Lifshitz of Danzig, the Tiferes Yisrael, the Ktav Sofer, who we also mentioned earlier, who said, I'll just go back to there really quickly. The Ktav Sofer said that, oh, I'm sorry, that was the Aruch LaNer who said that. The Aruch LaNer said that every God-fearing Jew who is familiar with the machine is pleased with the way it operates. So, sorry, going back. Next one. Said the Ketav Sofer, the Aruch LaNer. And one of the things that Rav Nathanson does here is he describes his own firsthand observation and testing of one of the matzah machines. And he writes, here is how the machine works. The dough is kneaded by hand. Of course, this is a translation. The dough is kneaded by hand and placed into the machine. Two strong men come and turn the wheel on one side of the machine, rolling the dough to the proper thickness. The dough is cut into circles, and the leftover pieces are immediately collected and run back through the machine a second time, and presumably no more than a second time. After that, the excess is discarded. The circles go on to two people who make holes in them and put them in the oven. From start to finish, this process takes no more than 3 minutes if the workers are zealous, and no more than 5 minutes even if they are not. All of this is done with cleanliness and purity, and no dough remains stuck to the machine. And these are his personal observations of what was going on. So we talked about the reasons that the others had to ban. So now we'll talk about the reasons that this group had to allow it, or more accurately, their responses to the reasons to ban. Because if you'll remember, it had already been many years that the machine had been allowed. And it's not that they're trying to find reasons to say why it's allowed, they're trying to find reasons to say why it shouldn't be banned, why it should continue to be allowed. So the first thing they note is that Rav Shlomo Kluger and many of the others in the original book relied on verbal and written descriptions of older machines that admittedly actually had issues, but they didn't actually watch or investigate modern machines at work. And therefore, they should not have issued rulings because they didn't actually see it themselves. The second thing, and this is really one of the bigger ones, they want to know why this large metal rolling pin turned by a wheel should be any worse than the small wooden rolling pin turned by hand. The only thing that matters is the person operating it. In effect, if the guy holding the wooden rolling pin says l'shem matzah mitzvah as he rolls the rolling pin, then the guy turning the wheel on the machine should say l'shem matzah mitzvah as he's turning the wheel. And then all that will be just fine, exactly the same. Additionally, they refer to improved machine designs that prevent dough from being stuck inside. One of the issues that was raised was that dough crumbs might be stuck. And they said, well, look, dough is not getting stuck. In response to the question of the matzah baking being income for poor people, so they replied, well, matzah baking really needs to be about getting the best possible matzah, not as a handout to poor people. The poor people will also benefit from better matzah. It'll be cheaper, it'll be simpler, and it'll be more kosher without hundreds of untrained hands being needed to roll the dough and make the holes and mix the dough and all that stuff, because matzah will be more consistent, the matzah will be more kosher. So yeah, the poor people won't necessarily make the money they were making, but matzah baking is not a charitable enterprise. It's to fulfill the mitzvah. Are you using this to fulfill the mitzvah? And is it being done in the best possible way? And finally, they also said, if you're worried, not finally, because I have some others here, but one of their final primary point here was, if you're worried about rerunning the dough through the machine that second time, so disallow that. And maybe we'll figure out how to better design it to reduce the waste, but still just disallow running it through a second time. Also, as I mentioned briefly earlier, they called into questions the motives of Rav Chaim Demitzer, and they also called into question whether he was actually a rabbi at all. He claimed to be a rabbi. He claimed to be one of the judges of the city I think it was in Brody, it may have been in Krakow, and they actually said that he might not be, that he was making a name, excuse me, he was claiming to be something that he was not, and the whole reason that he was doing this whole big fight was that he had a hidden agenda, that he just personally was against the machine and was cherry picking and looking for people who would help him. There are other notes, a very interesting note, that about the shape. They said the original Modah, they said that the matzah is not allowed to be square. The matzah needs to be round because that's the traditional shape. So it's noted that we learn some of the laws of matzah from the lechem hapanim, the bread that was put on the table in the Mishkan, in the Beit HaMikdash, and the Gemara in Beitzah and in Menachot talks about learning some of the halachot of matzah from there. The lechem hapanim were square, so there is precedent for matzah to be square, and therefore it's okay. So your matzah was round, but before that matzah was square. What then happened after the Bittul Modah came out is that the Jewish media of the time, the newspapers, which were primarily run by the Haskalah, the Enlightenment, and the Reform, decided that they could make a lot of noise about this story and they could drive a real wedge in, and they actually could use it to try to separate the religious Jewish community and to mess it up and to help strengthen the position of the Reform. At the same time, Rav Shlomo Kluger and Rav Yosef Shalom Nathanson put aside their differences on this to work together for their communities. I did mention the Shut Sheves Achim, which was in progress, of Rav Nathanson and Rav Ettinger, was lost, and that is one of the great tragedies of this whole story, is that sefer was lost. But we know that these Gedolim, these Rabbanim, still work together, and we see some great examples of it in a very humorous anecdote that Rav Shlomo Kluger and Rav Yosef Shalom Nathanson came together to Vienna to meet with the Kaiser about some matter of communal importance to both of their communities. Rav Shlomo Kluger sent a request to one of the officers asking if they could meet the Kaiser that day instead of waiting until the next morning when their meeting officially was. And the official replied they would have to wait until the next day for their scheduled meeting, quote, as the Kaiser is very busy and is not a machine. The story has it that Rav Shlomo Kluger smiled, turned to Rav Yosef Shalom Nathanson and said, you see, even in Vienna, they stay away from machines. So not only did they put it aside to work together, they actually could even joke about it with each other. There are some other thoughts on both sides. These are after the publication of the Modah and the Bittul Modah. The Divrei Chaim Sanzerov calls the matzah from the machine completely and totally chametz, because some machines allow dough to be stuck in the crevices inside, and because of that, we can't possibly allow it on the chance that could happen, and it could be chametz. And we have to assume the worst of the machine. We have to assume that there is going to be such dough stuck inside. Also against the machine, they said, well, even if you take the argument that you can operate the machine lishma, maybe you still need to have physical contact with the dough, because we talked about harvesting the wheat lishma for the purpose of matzah. We talked about grinding the wheat into flour lishma for the purpose of matzah. But now the guarding it for that purpose still needs to continue. It doesn't just stop now. So you also have to guard against chametz while you're kneading it and while you're baking it. And that needs to be done that needs to be done continuing with lishma, with guarding it. And the only way to guard a piece of dough, a batch of dough, while you're kneading it is to be touching it. There's no other way to do that. Interestingly, Rav Shlomo Kluger himself quotes that opinion, that lishma might require your physical contact with the dough, and he actually rejects it. He says that's not a reason to ban the machine because of two things. A, you touch the machine the same way you touch the rolling pin, and B, there are other workers in the facility, in a bakery, and you don't touch every single matzah. If you would say that lishma requires the dough to be touched, then the requirement, somebody announces l'shem matzot mitzvah, and that person has to have his hands on every single piece of dough, and that's just not practical to do, and clearly is not required. At the same time, the Shulchan Aruch Harav does also bring this lahalacha and say that lishma, while kneading the dough, requires actual contact with the dough. So those are other reasons against. Other reasons for that are discussed. We can say lishma, when starting a long-running process, can continue through the whole process. This actually is more relevant to modern machines, not to that original picture of the machine that only does the rolling, where, for example, you'll have a water-powered machine or an electrically powered machine. So how can those machines be made to be making matzah l'shem matzot mitzvah? And the answer is that starting the machine and saying l'shem matzot mitzvah as I press the button can be considered to be imparting a lishma, imparting your intent to the entire process. And the proof of that is from many places, including the Chazon Ish describes a discussion about whether you are allowed to use a water-powered machine to tie tzitzit. Making tzitzit also needs to be done lishma, and there's actually a requirement that as you tie knots, oh look, I can demonstrate. As you tie knots, because this one actually needs a knot, you will say l'shem mitzvat tzitzit, and you'll tie the knot, and you'll pull it tight. And if you didn't say that you have that intent of doing that, then you're going to have to untie it and redo it. So the Chazon Ish says, if you open the valve on a water-powered machine that ties the knots, and you say it as you open the valve, that's going to cover the entire operation of the machine, even though it's automated. The Marsham extends that to electrically operated machines, and also says, even if you didn't push the button, lishma, but if you took a matzah baking machine and you loaded the flour and water into it, and as you were loading the flour and water, you said l'shem matzot mitzvah, that was the start of the process, and pressing the button to start the machine operating you don't even need to say l'shem matzot mitzvah for that, because you started the process when you loaded up the ingredients. Other discussions about that include discussions about doing shchita, of killing an animal, slaughtering an animal using a machine. In practice, it's not really so easy to do that, but as a theoretical discussion, again, it has that same thing. If you started it l'shem shchita, even though there isn't really such an idea as much, but it's discussed. The second thing that's brought is about the question we raised about mixing and baking lishma. So Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank and others say lishma is not about the mixing and the baking. It's only about guarding and watching the ingredients. So you need to guard and watch the wheat while it is being harvested, while it's being stored, while it's being milled, while it's being mixed, while it's being baked. But you don't need to do the mixing and the baking lishma. You just need to be guarding it lishma during the mixing and baking processes. Someone have a question? I hear some noise. All right, I'll continue. So that's only a problem if the ingredients are in someone else's hand while they're being mixed and baked, because you cannot have intention over what is in someone else's hand. But if the stuff is in the machine and the machine is in your control, so you can have intention, you can have guarding and watching the stuff that is in the machine that you are controlling. And therefore, you do not have the problem of it being lishma. Rav Kook also discusses a similar idea and says, just like you can watch a water-powered mill grinding the wheat, lishma, so you can watch a water or electrically powered machine mix and bake the dough, lishma. So that's basically the standpoint of the two sides. And again, we discussed a whole bunch of different issues. The primary issue, as of 100 years ago, and up until actually fairly recently, we'll get to it at the very end, is this issue of lishma.
Moshe,
Yes.
you mentioned Rav Kook, and earlier you mentioned Manischewitz. Rav Kook has a tshuva in which he writes against machine matzahs.
I have it. We'll get there.
But he, in one of his students, Rav Moshe Tzvi Neria, writes that Rav Kook ate only machine matzahs.
I have it here in the on one of the upcoming slides.
Okay. Well, okay, go ahead.
So recent history on this, just very briefly, the Mishnah Berurah doesn't mention any of this at all, even though he knew about it. Mishnah Berurah was published in 1884. The Aruch HaShulchan doesn't mention any of this at all, also started publishing in 1884, volumes published through 1893. Neither of them mentions it at all. The idea of hand matzah versus machine matzah, nothing. It is suggested that the reason the Mishnah Berurah doesn't mention it is because the controversy was still ongoing in his time, and he knew that if he would say one way or the other, it would only just add his name to the list on one side or the other. It wouldn't actually sway anybody, and all it would do is reduce the readership of the Mishnah Berurah by 50% without actually having any useful impact, because whichever side he said against, they would just not read the Mishnah Berurah. So the Chafetz Chaim decided in a very Chafetz Chaim way to remain silent and not to come out on either side of the issue. That's conjecture. He did not say that himself. There are many who say that that was his reason. Rav Meir Shapiro, creator of Daf Yomi, used machine matzah. Manischewitz actually advertised that Rav Meir Shapiro used their matzah year-round while he was traveling and couldn't be sure of having a good kosher food supply. Rav Kook used machine matzah. Again, after visiting Manischewitz, that's the next slide. We'll talk a little more about Rav Kook's experience. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach used machine matzah from the Cohen Halpern Bakery. I've had their matzah. It's my favorite matzah. And Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach recalled later on that in his childhood, he remembers discussion about issues with the hand matzah bakeries not being clean and not being run properly in a good kosher way. And there was what the Yerushalmis would like to call a Pashgvilim war, each side posting posters all over the place. If you've ever been there and seen all the posters, you'll know what it looks like, of big arguments about the reliability of the hand matzah bakeries. And it was quite popular to use the machine matzah because it was more kosher and more clean. So a little bit about Rav Kook and machine matzah. In the Aruch Mishpat, Rav Kook writes he hasn't seen the machine, and he's not enthusiastic about permitting it, not because he thinks that the machine is a problem, but because not because he thinks the lishma is a problem, but because he's been told that the machines have chametz issues of dough getting stuck in the cracks, other things like that. But in terms of the question of intent, in terms of the question of lishma, it might be possible to find a leniency that will allow people to do it. However, in Rav Neria's book, as my father just mentioned, Rav Neria's biography of Rav Kook, it says that Rav Kook ate Manischewitz and Cohen Halpern machine matzah and actually only used machine matzah. So the question is, how would Rav Kook use this matzah that he himself wrote is possible to find excuses for people who use it? So my father wrote a letter, which I didn't include here because I didn't have the space, to Rav Neria to ask him. And this letter here is Rav Neria's reply. And Rav Neria basically says, after visiting a modern machine matzah bakery and seeing the modern machinery, Manischewitz, Cohen Halpern, these various others, he decided that the reduced risk of chametz, caused by the precision of the machines that improved kosher quality, was worth accepting the leniency about the intent that's required. Abba, did I get it right?
Yes, I didn't know you had that letter. Did I give that to
You
you?
sent it to me.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
12 years ago, you sent it to me.
Oh, okay.
Other recent history, recent being the last 100-odd years, Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank, who we mentioned earlier, brings a whole bunch of reasons. It's a very, very long discussion of allowing machine matzah. He brings, again, the example of the intent of the machine running by itself once you start it with the proper intent. Brings the example that we mentioned of the water-powered machine for tzitzit. Again, as long as the operator who started it has the intent, that carries through to the entire process. He also says a person can guard something that's not in his own hand. If it's in front of you in a box on the floor, you can guard that just fine. The only reason you can't guard it is if it is in someone else's hand and therefore you have no control over it. So again, in this case, it's in the machine. That means it's not in someone else's hand, it's just not in yours. But it's still in front of you and you can still be guarding it. He also says you could say that the issue of intent, of a machine having no intent, is not actually anything like a mentally incompetent person or a child or similar, because a person can have the incorrect intent. Non-Jew could say, I'm making these crackers because I like these crunchy crackers. And instead of saying, I'm making these so that a Jew can fulfill the commandment of eating matzah. Or a child can say, I'm making this because I want to chop it up into little pieces and have matzah brai, as opposed to the intent of making it for matzah and for the mitzvah. And again, the difference, a machine can't have the wrong intent. A machine can only have no intent, and therefore you can impose your intent on the machine. And he notes this was already widely accepted in the use of water-powered flour mills. You don't need to have someone actually turning the crank on the mill to hand grind the wheat, though there are actually bakeries that still do that, hand grind all the wheat. But it was widely accepted that you could use a water-powered flour mill.
Or bicycle grind the wheat.
Or bicycle grind the wheat. I have never used one of the bicycle grinders. I've only used the hand grinder.
They do actually do that in Yerushalayim, to have people on a bicycle grinding wheat.
I've done the hand grinding. I haven't done the bicycle. Yeah, when I was in Israel, it was 11 years ago, I went to one of these places, and you can either do it volunteer or they'll pay you some minimal amount to just stand there turning the wheel and turning the wheel and turning the wheel. And it's a lot harder than it looks. He also says, given, we'll have to speed up a little here, we're over time. I have nowhere to go except Mariv, but other people might have things to do. He says, given that resolution that we've described of all the issue of intent, now we'll say the machine is preferable because we've eliminated human error. We've sped up the baking process. Again, a modern machine matzah bakery is just a few minutes from the beginning to the end, where the hand process can still take some extra time. And then he has one final point that he makes, which I deliberately skipped through, didn't discuss before, where some of those who said that we should ban machine matzah said that we should ban it because it's something new, and we just don't do new things. We keep things the way that they were. So he says, okay, if you're going to say that innovation is going to be banned, you can only ban innovation that could possibly have been done in the past. and it wasn't done in the past, and therefore, who are we to create something new if the previous generations decided that it wasn't necessary? So therefore, it's irrelevant that until 1838, Jews only ate handmade matzah. There was no such thing as a matzah making machine. Before the Industrial Revolution, no one was using machines for anything at all. The word may not even have existed. I don't know the origins of that. But if you're going to ban innovation because a previous generation didn't have it, then you have to ban refrigerators, which they didn't have. You have to ban gas and electricity, which they didn't have. And we don't find that being the case. There are innovations we say we'd prefer not to do because previous generations didn't do them, but that's because previous generations could have done them. One other interesting historical note, there is a researcher in Yerushalayim who discovered a 13th century text from the Meiri in the Magen Avot, who describes a process of baking using a machine. So in reference to Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank's last point, not only is it possible that the innovation could have been done before 1838, it could have been done in the 1200s and may have just been lost to time, because the Meiri seems to describe it. And Rav Shlomo Aaron Wertheimer, the researcher who found this manuscript, suggests that if the Gedolim of the 1800s had been aware of this Meiri, they never would have banned the machine matzah. However, Rav Moshe Feinstein, the Chazon Ish, many other Gedolim were very wary of evaluating halacha from lost manuscripts, because maybe there's a reason they were lost. And we don't just decide that all of a sudden this manuscript is canonical law, canonical halacha. We would have to have a very, very good reason to do that, and just discovering a manuscript isn't enough. Other recent Gedolim, the Stipler, Rav Yaakov Yisrael Kanievsky, great Gadol in Israel, gave his children machine matzah on Pesach and was criticized by his brother-in-law, the Chazon Ish, who said it's chametz and it needs to be destroyed. Now, it's very interesting. If you'll remember a few minutes ago, we said that the Chazon Ish says that the question of lishma in a machine is not a problem, because the Chazon Ish says you can use a machine to tie tzitzit. So for years and years, I've been giving this and just moving on at this point. This year, I discovered the reason that the Chazon Ish said that the machine matzah is chametz and must be destroyed, which is a fascinating reason. The Chazon Ish believed that it is impossible to bake matzah on a conveyor belt, because the Shulchan Aruch says the dough needs to be placed onto the hot surface of the oven. It can't be put on a room temperature pan and put in the oven in a pan, and it can't be put on a paper. The dough needs to be placed directly on the surface, on the already hot surface. And it's not possible to do that in a matzah bakery, because at the same time that the conveyor belt needs to be instantly hot inside the oven, it also needs to be quite cold outside the oven, because otherwise you'll have the problem we discussed of the dough being warm and rising before it actually gets to the oven. So according to the Chazon Ish, it is physically impossible to make a kosher machine matzah. Others, Rav Tukachinsky, very famous Luach Eretz Yisrael, Gesher HaChaim, Sefer on mourning, personally ate hand matzah, but he gave reasons to allow machine matzah to be used. He said the intent of lishma can be fulfilled by someone supervising the machine. And also he says, again, the problem with watching another person is you can't control it, but watching a machine, you're controlling it. He also says we've discussed all of these ideas. He just is a modern, fairly modern source that mentions them, that the intent of pushing the button to start the machine may carry through the entire process. So how do things stand now? What do people do? In Israel, the Hasidim use hand matzah. The Perushim, they were called 100 years ago, now we would say a traditional Yerushalmi, a non-Hasidim, students of the Vilna Gaon, they use machine matzah. Outside Yerushalayim, there are many opinions. Not really so easy to categorize. People are very opinionated in Israel. In America, Hasidim also use hand matzah. Most yeshivish people in America are using hand matzah, not like in Israel. Many others use machine matzah because it's the most easily obtainable. And again, traditionally in America, people use machine matzah. It is a fairly modern development. It's post World War II that there is hand matzah production in the United States. And especially true that there is hand matzah production enough to meet the yeshivish and other demand for machine matzah in America. In 1920, Manischewitz was already making 1.25 million matzah per day, which is an absolutely staggering number. Even today, with the resurgence of popularity of hand matzah over probably only the last 40 or 50 years, there's nowhere near that much hand matzah in this country. The vast bulk of the matzah in this country is machine matzah. So finally,
shout out to Moshe's great grandfather, who was the foreman at Manischewitz for many, many, many years.
Yes. I'll note also Manischewitz, the company, as well as Dov Ber Manischewitz and his son Yaakov Uriah Manischewitz, have something like 50 patents involved in the manufacturing process of matzah and other foods, mostly matzah. So now finally, before we end, we'll look at a few modern innovations in matzah baking. Comparing again, if we go back to the very beginning, we have this little picture here of an ancient machine in Poland, where literally all it is a machine for rolling out the dough. Now I have to skip all the way back through to where we're up to. Oops. I should have put that picture back again. Here we are. So modern innovations in machine matzah. One is chabura matzah, which we'll say is, quote, more lishma. If you look at the picture on the left is at Manishevitz's current factory, maybe not their current factory, but definitely they're a recent Manischewitz factory. This is a tube where the flour drops completely automated from a big tank of flour down into the mixer, which is below the bottom of the image. And all that happens is a worker pushes the button, says L'Shem Matzah Mitzvah, and pushes the button. In contrast, Chabura Matzah is the picture on the right. This is a pail, I think it's 10 pounds of flour. This is a mixer bucket. And every time they make a batch of dough, someone by hand is saying L'Shem Matzah Mitzvah and dumping a bucket of flour down into this mixing trough. So Chabura Matzah, which is done by these groups of people working in the machine matzah bakery, is more lishma, we'll say, because more of the start of the process has people's hands on it, has people saying L'Shem Matzah Mitzvah. That's one modern innovation. Another is cooling equipment, both before and after the oven. One of the major problems with the early belt-driven ovens, where the matzah would just run through on a conveyor belt, is that the conveyor belt itself would start getting warm before you actually approached the oven, and therefore the dough might start to rise there, and we discussed why that would be an issue. So this picture actually is a picture of the cooling equipment after the matzah exits the oven, and I think this is actually at Cohen Halpern, but I don't remember where it's from, of the equipment for cooling the matzah, both before and after the oven. After the oven, parenthetically, also helps cool the belt so that when it comes around again, it's not hot from the oven. Another is the type of mixers. If you look at the picture on the left, This is an Israeli film strip from 1951. It's available on YouTube. You can see the worker has a pot in his hands and is loading the pot up onto a vertical mixer. And there you can see the blades of the mixer sticking down. The problem here is a mixer adds a lot of friction, adds a lot of movement, and that causes the dough to heat up. And that's especially true because the consistency of machine matzah dough is extremely, extremely dry. They use the absolute minimal amount of water required, which means it's going to get very hot. And again, you have that problem of the heat. So the newer innovation, this is a modern mixer in a modern bakery, I believe this is in Lakewood, is that the mixer is horizontal. The paddles spin around in circles, and that incorporates some air in order to cool the dough. And also the dough is not spinning around against the sides of the pot, as in this one, it's going up into the air just so it's not against the surfaces. It reduces the friction and it causes the dough to stay cooler while it's being worked. Recently, I just found a source that discusses how much dough can be made at once. And they say the old vertical mixer here, these are still used in modern matzah bakeries. Cohen Halpern, for example, where they've been using the same equipment for over 100 years, they recommend making no more than 5 pounds of dough at once, because if you make more than that, the more dough you have, the more friction you get, the hotter it gets. Whereas this newer paddle-based mixer, you can make up to 15 pounds of dough at once because of the improvements in cooling or reduction in heating. Another innovation is multi-zone ovens. Here we've got some old pictures. Traditional hand matzah oven with one big opening and a paddle used to put the matzah in and take the matzah out. Here you have a picture of an early machine where you just have the dough going in, and you can see the big opening here, but it's not that big an oven. On the right here is Manashevitz's modern oven. It's 150 feet long. It has 138 gas burners, and every one of the burners is individually controlled to be able to have a multi-zone heating system such that you can bake the matzah in the way that will get it baked the quickest with the least possibility of becoming chametz due to the warming process. And depending on which matzah they're making, regular or whole wheat, the limited shmura run, various other things, they will actually have those burners all set differently for the recipe, and they will test and they'll calculate and they'll measure and all that stuff. And it's one of the biggest innovations in the kashrut of machine matzah in terms of not becoming chametz. The other final modern innovation is Teflon and other non-stick coatings. Again, the issues of chametz possibly getting stuck in the machine just because there are crumbs that get stuck in odd places. You have non-stick coatings in places. You actually also have, I've not seen this written anywhere. I've not seen it myself either. I was told by a rabbi in Israel who inspected a matzah bakery that they actually have sensors in some possible problem areas and alarms that ring if dough gets stuck in certain dangerous parts of the machine. So there's lots going on. It is still actually an issue that's being debated. There's some fairly recent articles about modern innovations and whether there might actually be more problems in a modern bakery because of the sheer scale at which they're operating. In either case, enjoy your matzah. I'm done. Any questions?
Excellent share, Moshe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Moshe.
Thank you.
Happy birthday.
You too.
Yeshkach Moshe, very informative.
Yasher Koach, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oops, no. I closed the screen, but I didn't leave the meeting. I should do leave.